Guys, I lost my virginity. My visual novel virginity, that is. I'm sorry, I had no clue how to start this video, but it's true. Thanks to a recommendation, I started Witch on the Holy Night back in May, which I will call by its abbreviated Japanese name, Mihoyo, for the rest of this video. But what is Mihoyo if you are unfamiliar with it? Well, for the simplest premise, an ordinary boy from the mountains, Sojiro Shizuki, moves to Misaki, a small town where two witches, Aoko Aozaki and Alice Koonji, reside. And the story basically explores what happens from their paths crossing and how they learn to live and deal with it. So over the course of the past 2 months, I slowly completed Mihoyo, and as of the time of recording, I've done every chapter possible, and I can now confidently say that I love my entire experience with Mihoyo. It was such a touching story, and ever since I've finished it, I've wanted to make a video on it, so here it is. I really just wanted to record my thoughts somewhere to discuss my experience from the start to the end of Mihoyo, and how my feelings and opinions changed over the course of it without detailing too much of the plot in order to prevent this video from being like 2 hours long. But it's also because I want to try and make this video spoiler free in the case that someone unfamiliar with Mihoyo does come across this video and gets interested enough to check it out. Mihoyo is such a gem that I really don't see discussed anywhere, so if I can get even one person intrigued, then I accomplished one of my goals. Especially because the first movie is coming out later this year, I really do think it's worth reading before viewing the movie. I might go into some very light spoilers just on the general structure and pacing, as well as some of the things that happen early on in the plot, but I will try my best to do nothing more than that. So I guess we should get started. I feel like I should begin by mentioning that Mihoyo was my first real visual novel. Not something like Danganronpa, which I have played and there are gameplay elements, just one where the entire experience is just reading. And I'll be honest, I wasn't really impressed with Mihoyo initially, at least for like the first 5 chapters or so. And I do think that was because of my inexperience with visual novels. I wasn't expecting to spend 2 hours reading the very first chapter with barely any plot progression. Chapter 1 and 2 are quite a slow burn, meant to flesh out the world and characters, and the plot doesn't really get started until around chapter 3. But the problem for me is that like chapter 3 takes like 3 to 4 hours to get to. Coming from a background of mainly playing gacha games, the stories in gachas usually take that same amount of time to get its entire point across, so when it takes that long for the plot to just initiate in Mihoyo, I won't lie, I do remember being a bit annoyed. I feel like there should have been more substantial plot points between the prologue and chapter 3 to hook the reader in. But looking back at it now, my criticism was mainly due to not being used to the pacing of the medium that Mihoyo was in, and expecting pacing more akin to a gacha game story. Which is really stupid, I know. The pacing is inherently going to be slower in a visual novel because they have to spend time describing the setting and atmosphere of a scene and writing. I really do appreciate the earlier chapters now, and I will explain why later. I did say though, that my disappointment during my playthrough carried to chapter 5, which basically serves as a climax to a very slow first act. All hell breaks loose after what was mostly a very mundane first 4 chapters. And this might be a hot take, but this climax was probably the lowest point of Mihoyo for me, and I still hold this opinion at the time of recording. It's not that chapter 5 is necessarily bad, the writing is actually very solid and it is an extremely pivotal chapter for the story and characters. It just has to do with it not suiting my taste, as I'm not a fan of reading action. I've realized after reading Mihoyo and another book I finished recently that I just don't like action in literature. The fights were probably my least favorite parts of Mihoyo. I think I just struggle visualizing these fights in my head even with the help of the artwork. They're just something I would rather watch animated than read. So when the majority of both parts of chapter 5 are mostly action sequences, I wasn't vibing with it. And this problem was only exacerbated by how long chapter 5 was. It had 2 parts, and in total it was over 5 hours of reading if I remember correctly. So after I finished this chapter, I was really questioning why people were calling Mihoyo peak. Even ignoring my displeasure reading action, I didn't find anything about what I read in the first 5 chapters to be that special. It was just another story. But I tried to remember early on that this is a complete story. You have to judge it as a whole picture. This goes back to how gacha games have just completely fried my brain in how I interpret stories. I think I was expecting immense emotional payoff in a short span of time, which chapter 5 was not going to do. So I kept continuing into what is basically Act 2. The 6th chapter mainly covers the aftermath of the previous one and how the situation the main characters are placed in is going to play out. It was a very exposition heavy chapter focusing a lot on magecraft and the influence of mages in the world. Maybe it's recency bias, but I found the magecraft in miHoYo a lot more interesting compared to other Type Moon works. To be fair, I'm still quite of a Type Moon novice. The only other works I've seen are UBW and Fate Zero, but I still think I prefer how grounded and rooted in logic the magecraft in miHoYo is compared to like the servants in Noble Phantasms and Fate. It's not like the characters in miHoYo do anything crazy, it's more just how they come to activate their abilities, which I found more compelling. It does become a bit convoluted towards the end though, and I want to believe that I was paying very close attention to miHoYo while I was reading. If you go watch my playthrough, which you can find on my VOD channel in the description, you will find that I was narrating every unvoiced line, taking frequent pauses to analyze and discuss things with my chat, voicing every thought I had out loud, and despite all that, I still can't confidently explain anything to you. Besides the exposition though, Chapter 6 did start placing roots for why I love miHoYo. Before this chapter, the story mostly focused on only 2 of the main characters, but now Act 2 starts centering around all 3. And that leads me to Chapter 7, where everything just started clicking for me. I think I said it best after finishing it. I think surprisingly, that was probably my favorite chapter so far. I don't know what, like, I think the reason why I like this chapter so much was it felt focused and concise. It felt like there was an actual structure to the chapter, like there was an actual climax with that whole chapter was just building up to that conversation at the end as a climax, and I don't know, I was just very invested in this chapter for some reason. Yeah, I think I enjoy the character interactions way more in this game. This chapter was much more focused on the character dynamics, which I enjoyed much more reading than reading about a fight, so nice. It's my favorite chapter so far, probably. I was very invested in this chapter. So besides being a great chapter on its own, it was around this point in my playthrough where I really just began seeing what made miHoYo so special, at least for me. It's seeing the 3 main characters interact and help each other develop that gives this work so much heart. It was never about having a grand, ambitious story with insane fights. The best parts of miHoYo for me were when these characters are placed in a mundane scenario and they just talk. I was so invested during Chapter 7, trying to analyze the nuance in what was being said, reading into what each character was thinking, and realizing the significance of these small moments of interaction. And can I take a second to glaze the soundtrack of this game? It does such a phenomenal job of filling the atmosphere and emotion of the setting and scenes. Such a nice mix of classical and contemporary music. I'm sorry if I'm talking out of my ass here, I know nothing about music or music theory. All I know is that the vibes of this soundtrack were immaculate while playing. All of the background music in this video so far has been from the soundtrack, and I don't care if I get copyright claimed. I can't even monetize videos, so they can go ahead with it. I just hope I don't get a strike. And the soundtrack isn't just great for the atmosphere, but also in representing the characters. Aoko's main theme, for example, being a modern piece that transitions from a slow melody filled with uncertainty into a fast-paced rhythm that has this real sense of determination, and like you're going to pull through with the very thing you set your mind to. It definitely has that signature Hideyuki Fukusawa sound to it, and one of the first things I thought of when I initially heard it was how much it reminded me of some of the tracks in UBW. Another piece I want to discuss is one of Alice's themes. This is personally my favorite piece of the entire soundtrack. What amazes me is just how many emotions it captures. I think it does such a good job at portraying the type of aura that Alice exudes. Its melody is so calming while simultaneously being mysterious and interesting, and then at certain points it gives off this ethereal and even heavenly sensation. The fact that it also uses much more classical instrumentation to represent Alice's background of growing up in a household with very old-fashioned Minster magecraft to contrast with Aoko's much more wild and free personality and magecraft, it's so good. And I think how I'm describing the range of emotion in Alice's theme is proven by how it was incorporated into the visual novel. It is such a versatile piece that's used in several different contexts, whether it was a very simple conversation between characters or a conclusion to a battle, it just always fit. I'd be here all day though if I were to describe how every track is used, and I'm definitely not the person qualified for it, so we'll stop here. Back to my experience with the story, so by chapter 8, I was fully on board with miHoYo. I started having so much fun just watching the slice of life scenes that were also crucial for building character chemistry. Like honestly, Act 2 might be my most cherished time experiencing miHoYo and played a very large role in why I ended up getting so invested in these characters. As a standalone chapter though, 8 definitely wasn't as strong as 7, but I don't think that was the point of it. Instead, 8 really just served as a chance to let the characters breathe, as well as start foreshadowing details of Act 3, which is basically the main focus of Chapter 9. I realize I haven't mentioned the side plot that's been brewing over the course of the story yet. And while I enjoyed all the slice of life moments in Act 2, there was always a thought in the back of my mind of wondering when this side plot would become relevant. I'm already 8 chapters in. Are they going to have enough time to flesh it out with only 5 chapters left? But fortunately, it really starts to come into fruition in this chapter, and they did it so naturally. 9 ends up becoming a very nice transition between the second and third acts. And let me tell you, if Act 2's purpose was to get you really invested into these characters, then the third act is where all the emotional payoff is. But before I get more into Act 3, I feel like this is now the best time to mention all the extra side stories in miHoYo. So if you weren't aware, miHoYo has extra chapters you can view in the archive as side stories. While you can ignore them and focus on the base chapters, I really do think they are worth doing in chronological order as you unlock them. For the majority of these extras, I wouldn't even consider them as filler. You can understand the main story without them, but the extra chapters add a ton of context and foreshadowing to the story and later events that happen. And they actually provide some great characterization for the side characters as well. Now as for my experience, I did all the side stories after I finished the final chapter, and it did have its merits doing it in that way. I was kind of nervous prior to starting them, thinking they were gonna be pointless filler, but as soon as I did the first one, I was just so happy to see these characters that I fell in love with one more time. And surprisingly, some of the extras solved the issue I had initially in the earlier chapters, where there was a lack of engaging story beats to keep new readers hooked, to the point where some scenes should have just been included in the main chapters in my opinion. So overall, I recommend doing them chronologically, and even if you don't, I still think you can find them endearing. Returning to the main plot, chapters 10 to 13 culminates in what I would consider one of the best third acts of a story I've ever experienced. Not only due to how the plot progresses, but also in how it raises up the significance of everything that's come before. If you recall me saying I appreciate the earlier chapters now, this is the reason why. There are certain moments and decisions in these last few chapters that just wouldn't have been possible if they didn't spend all that time in the first act fleshing out these characters. The writing would have felt so illogical if you didn't understand the nature of our protagonist. The payoff was so rewarding, and because of this foundation that's been developed so strongly, it allowed the story to go into such unpredictable territory while still feeling natural. I personally felt around this point that the story could have gone like 4 different routes, and all of them could have made sense from a writer's perspective because of what was established. This final act did such a masterful job of wrapping up these character arcs that started in chapter 1 as well as the remaining loose ends in the story. By the time the credits started rolling, I was completely satisfied. I basically had no questions remaining. What's funny is that Act 3 is probably the part I'd like to spend the most time on, but I can't because it's the most spoiler heavy section, and I did say I wanted to make this video spoiler free, so I guess it's my fault. But I also really need to mention that scene that happens eventually. If you do or do not know which one I'm talking about, I uploaded my reaction to it on the channel. Please do not watch it if you haven't read miHoYo. I've never had such a visceral reaction to reading something before. Now to be fair, miHoYo is a visual novel. The voice acting and artwork helped my immersion and investment a ton, so I don't know if I would have had the same reaction from purely reading words. But it is what it is. What an incredible scene from a narrative and character writing perspective. Regardless of what happened after that moment, I think anything would have still made sense. It was just so unpredictable, especially with the vibe of miHoYo. I was so overwhelmed emotionally, and I never thought that reading could evoke that kind of reaction out of me, to the point where I cried horrendously. But this wasn't even the only time I cried. There was actually another instance. In the very final scene, I teared up again. It was tears of joy, thankfully. I think that time it was due to just looking back on my entire journey with miHoYo and being so happy with the way it ended. I couldn't hold it back. The fact that a story mainly told through words moved me this much emotionally, in my opinion, just showcases how well crafted and endearing this whole story really was. So that was basically the telling of my experience with miHoYo. I really hope I did it justice. If you made it to the end, then first of all, thank you. But second, I'm assuming that means you are probably someone who has already read miHoYo and just wanted to hear another person's opinion, or I did a good enough job at selling it to you if you haven't tried it. For the latter, I highly recommend you to read Mihoyo before ever watching the movie whenever it comes out. And I say this because I think the movie will ruin your impression of Mihoyo if you don't know what it's actually like. If the movie releases in the way I assume it will just be another Ufotable movie with really impressive action set pieces and not much else to it. I'm assuming the first movie will only cover the first act, which is bad because as I said, Mihoyo really should be looked at in its full picture. And not only that, but Act 1 is already like 10 to 12 hours of content that is gonna be packed into 2 hours. I have a very strong feeling that they are just going to cut out or speed through all the slower slice of life moments where you learn to love these characters. And mainly, it'll just focus on the fights, the hype and aura moments, which in my opinion are not what make Mihoyo so special. It will just become something very forgettable. As for me though, I will definitely be watching the film whenever it comes out in the States. I'm sure it'll be great for my experience. But I think Mihoyo has put me on my visual novel arc as well. I have been fucking enlightened. I really doubt anything will ever top Mihoyo for me. Aside from being what I would consider a nearly perfect story, it also just holds a special place in my heart now for being the very first visual novel I've ever read and ended up loving so dearly. Probably gonna start with more Type Moon stuff first because I realized Kinoko Natsu is a fucking beast at writing characters. I think I heard somewhere that Mihoyo was the first thing he actually wrote for the Natsuverse, which is crazy. But yeah, I'd like to start with the Tsukihime remake if that ever gets ported. If not, I will probably read the original Fate Stay Night to get started. There's also Kara no Kyokai, but I'm still not really sure how to consume that, whether I want to do it with the light novels or the movies, but I'm thinking about it. I'd really like to end this video with a more profound message, but I don't have one, so my closing remarks will be, thank you for watching, and please try Mihoyo. Goodbye.